Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to get started with this morning's discussion. So thanks for joining us today. I'm Peter Watts, Managing Director with the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center. We'll get started with our session today. So this morning we're going to be talking about tackling barley seeding and production management practices. The presentation is presented by the CMBTC in collaboration with Saskatchewan Barley Development Commission, Alberta Grains, and the Manitoba Crop Alliance. So I'd like to welcome our presenters this morning. We have Mitchell Japp, Research and Extension Manager with Saskatchewan Barley, Andrew Hector, Agronomy Extension Specialist for Cereal Crops at Manitoba Crop Alliance, and Jeremy Boychin, Director of Research at Alberta Grains. And we also have Haley Stacey at CMBTC, who is managing this morning's slides and presentation. So we'll start off with a short introduction by me talking a little bit about desired end-use quality for malting barley, followed by the main part of our discussion today, which will be seeding and agronomy considerations. We'll talk a little bit at the end about the new varieties and their acceptance in the international marketplace, and then we'll have time for questions. There is a chat function and a Q&A function. Please feel free to use either of them during the discussion this morning. You can type your questions in and Haley will read them out and we can tackle them as we go through the presentation. So no need to wait till the end to put your questions in. We have about an hour, so we'll get moving quite quickly with the discussion. So just to start off and frame things, as we talk about malting barley quality, some of the key end-use requirements that malting companies and brewers are looking for in malting barley include protein content. Typically, the malting industry is looking for protein content in malting barley between 10 and 12.5%. Although there is some flexibility there for some of our international markets like China, which is obviously a very important market, malting companies will accept higher protein content up to a maximum of about 13.5%. So protein content is one of the major considerations when growing malting barley, trying to get into that zone. Germination is very important. The barley has to be in living condition when it arrives at a malt plant. And typically the specifications for a malting company are minimum 95% germination. Obviously, the higher the better. Varietal purity is also an important consideration for producers, as malting companies like to process malt barley varieties individually or identity preserved. So minimum 95% varietal purity is typically what a grain company would be selling as a specification, or a malting company would require from a producer. Kernel plumpness is correlated with high extract levels in malting barley, important for brewers. And the team today will talk about how to achieve uniform plump kernels. And finally, peeled and broken is an important consideration. We won't be talking about that today. That'll be addressed in a subsequent discussion later in the spring or summer, perhaps in July, when we talk about harvest management practices. As you can see in the table, there is some differentiation among end users in terms of protein content requirements. So depending on your buyer and their market outlets, they may be more interested in lower versus higher protein content. So it is important to talk to your grain buyer about what they're looking for in terms of end-use quality. This is the CMBTC recommended list. This is the 25-26 recommended list that was issued in November. The 5 major varieties that we recommend producers grow This year are AAC Connect, CDC Fraser, CDC Churchill, AAC Synergy, and CDC Copeland. You can see in the pie chart, AAC Synergy is the top grown malting barley variety today, with 33.6% of seeded area to malt barley in Western Canada in 2024, followed by Copeland, Connect, Fraser, and Churchill. There are some additional malting barley varieties that are available for contracting programs with grain companies or other buyers like Legacy, Bill Coors 100, and CDC Gold Star. And we do have new varieties in development like AAC Prairie and AB Foothills. So today we're going to be addressing through the discussion how to achieve good quality in malt barley, including protein content, things like testing for soil fertility to understand, and understanding varietal characteristics is important. Varieties like CDC Fraser that tend to have, say, higher protein content versus CDC Churchill that has lower protein content. As mentioned, germination is very important. Harvesting early to avoid end of season moisture and pre-harvest sprouting is key. Varietal purity, as I mentioned, is important, and producers can ensure varietal purity by purchasing certified seed or ensuring that they test their seed prior to seeding. And as mentioned, kernel plumpness and uniformity is associated with seeding rates, and that can also help producers be selected for malt barley. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Hector to get started with today's discussion.
So thanks, Peter, for setting up the discussion today. We felt like seeding was right around the corner until here in Manitoba we got quite a bit of snow just yesterday. But achieving and reaching the malt quality characteristics that Peter stated is outlined on the last slide starts early, and that's what we're really going to discuss today about seeding considerations, but also in crop production considerations when growing malting barley. So you can move forward there, Haley. So starting the season off right. So planting early has been recognized by farmers, agronomists, and researchers to optimize both yield and use quality, and for many crops, including barley. The advantages of seeding early are that the crop gets to utilize early spring moisture. It can be more weed competitive as well. It avoids a hot period during the growing season, as well as there's some insect and disease pressures can be reduced. And there's also harvest consideration with that. So barley is not quite as cold tolerant as wheat, but still relatively tolerant. So there isn't, unlike wheat, where we have some great ultra early seeding data, it's limited in barley. So the general rule is when seeding is looking at soil temps between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius at seed depth. And pulling that further, seeding early has been recommended, and this is looking at mass data here in Manitoba, looking at relative yield by week and month of your sowing date. So that you can see, so it's recommended usually between the last week of April into May is when to seed barley. But you can see how the relative yield drops quite substantially as you move through the first week of May all the way to the first week of June, which is the relative yield in barley, which is that brown line in the center, drops to between 70 and 80%. So these results are also followed up by small plot research, and I'll pass it off to Jeremy to speak to a little bit that's been done in southern Alberta that which results are congruent with this mask data.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It was interesting looking at this and remembering some of the research that Ross McKenzie had done in southern Alberta under irrigation with barley, looking at how much yield are we losing when we're seeding later and later, or when we're seeding earlier and earlier, how much yield are we gaining? And these results are similar to what we see in southern Alberta with that research. And yeah, it's capturing whatever early season moisture we can get, but we know in Alberta, those July days can get pretty darn hot during grain fill. So the further we can push that earlier in the season, the less likely impact those hot conditions or those potentially dry conditions will have on that grain fill, which could impact plumpness, could impact germination. So it really is all around benefit. But it's interesting talking to farmers now, because it's get your barley in early, get your wheat in early, get your peas in earlier. So it does really need to have a balance between all those crops and what your priorities are on your farm to identify, which crop should I be getting in first. But for those malt barley growers, if you're targeting that malt end use, getting that crop in early is gonna play huge benefits for you in the long run.
And on top of that, from some of this research that happened in Alberta and across the prairies, delayed seeding also had some adverse effects on malt quality in the end, or malt quality specs. So there's that aspect of it as well. If you're thinking about if you're seeding early, you might want to start. You also think about your seeding rate and how that plays into potential mortality and a seed treatment as well.
I guess this is me. Yeah, so tying into that early seeding of malt target, one thing to consider is your seeding rate. And I know this example that's shown in the visual here is wheat, but we can expect pretty much the exact same thing when it comes to barley. You see the top left image there. We have canola at 200 seeds per meter squared, and in this situation, canola is represented as a weed or as a competitor. And wheat seeded at 200 seeds per meter squared. And as you see that wheat seeding rate increase, but the canola rate stay the same, we see that competitive aspect that jumps in. So making sure that you're seeding based on appropriate seeding rates, what that target range is, where you're in around the 25 plants per square foot based on your seed quality, based on your survivability of that seed. Targeting those higher seeding rates, making sure you have a good stand, is going to help with your weed competition. And that's going to play dividends for you throughout the season. It's going to help making sure that the fertilizer you're putting down, you're taking good advantage of it. It's going to help make sure that the crop is more even. When you have a low seeding rate, what happens is you leave more opportunity for secondary tillers to come in later in the season, albeit environmental impacts can play a huge role in that as well. But those secondary tillers and tertiary tillers, what they end up contributing to later in the season is potential greens, potential variability in staging and plump. So again, getting those higher seeding rates can play a big role in weed competition and in quality and in yield potential. So making sure you have that dialed in, again, is going to play dividends for you through the season. And when you think about fungicide application on this as well, when we talk about tertiary and secondary tillers, the less of those tertiary tillers you have, the more even crop you have, which means your application timing across that crop when it comes to crop stage of each of those tillers and each of those plants is going to be more ideal. And this really ties into the Fusarium Head Blight aspect of it, because if you have much later tillers that are coming, your heads are coming up much later. If your application timing isn't ideal for those, it poses a much larger risk for some of those to become infected and impact quality. So multiple benefits that come from making sure your seeding rate is ideal. And we'll talk a little bit about weed control later on too, as that pertains to some risks. So next slide. So this is an example I like to show. This ties back to making sure you get your seed tested to understand what you're working with, to target those appropriate seeding rates, to get those benefits of making sure you're getting the appropriate plant stand. If you look at the top left image there, what I've done is using the Alberta Grain seeding rate calculator, I've targeted a plant stand of 25 plants per square foot. And what I've done is I've adjusted the 1,000 kernel weight or the seed weight to demonstrate the variability in what the actual pounds per acre you would need to put down to achieve that plant stand. And this is assuming a 90% germ of that seed lot and a 15% mortality. Your germ you're going to get from your seed test, your mortality is going to relate more towards your farm growing conditions when you're putting it in the ground. So this is something that a agronomist farmer should be tracking over the long term. How many seeds are you putting in the ground and how many are actually emerging to get that number? And you can see the difference between I believe the top one was a 40 grams per 1,000 kernels, and the bottom was a 50 grams per 1,000 kernels. And you have about a 30-pound difference between what's going down per acre. So making sure you get your seed weights assessed to make sure you're putting down the right amount of seed is going to be vital to making sure you get the right plant stand, you're reducing tertiary tillers, you're getting an even crop, good weed competition, better quality in the end. Next slide.
I guess this one's for me then. And I think maybe before we jump into the soil testing and nitrogen management portion, just to add on to Jeremy's comment about that range in seed size and seed weight. When I was working more closely with the regional variety testing, I looked at the seed weights coming in. We see it across a range of varieties. The difference is quite staggering as to how much seed size difference there can be, both between varieties and within the same variety, depending on where the source of that seed was coming from. So, the environment where it was produced or grown in really plays an impact. So it's not the same every year, even if you're using the same variety. So I guess continuing on with the theme of setting the malt barley crop up for success, soil testing and nitrogen management is the next step in that. And we focused in on nitrogen because it is that big driver towards yield. The other nutrients are certainly important. Nitrogen is the big one where we get the yield from, and also where we see some of the problems from. So getting that understanding of the picture for nitrogen is really important to do that up front. So whether fall or spring soil test, I think a soil test is the best way that we have in order to guide those nitrogen decisions. It's not the only way, but it is the best. And that can be done as a composite sample across the field or in more specific zone management. And even if you're not applying zone management, it may be worthwhile looking at the field from some set from even as simplistic as low slope or the bottom of the slope, mid slope, and upper parts of the knolls to separate and guide that management decision for nitrogen. Yeah, I mentioned there are other ways to look at fertility. Certainly, you can look at the nitrogen removed, fertility removed from the previous crop, and try and balance that. One of the tools available there would be the prairie nutrient removal calculator, to give an indication of if you have for growing a crop of 100 bushel an acre barley or 80 bushel of barley, you can go in and see what the fertility requirements are. The part that you're lacking with those types of tools are to get an indication of what the mineralization capacity of that soil is going to be, and that can really drive protein later in the season. So those are certainly some when looking for soil testing. As we move into the next slide, where we have some charts on the relationship with nitrogen and yield and other malt characteristics, I think it's trying to drive towards that fine line between yield and end use quality. And we want to see malt barley be a competitive crop, and we think that it is, because it doesn't require the same amount of inputs as a lot of other crops, because barley is inherently competitive. We've seen big improvements in disease resistance that help grow successful crops, and it can yield really well if it's managed as it needs to be. So this is a little bit older research that was led by John O'Donovan at Ag Canada in Lacombe, and it was a prairie-wide research drawing together sites from all over the prairies and distilling them down into some very clear messaging on what is needed for barley and nitrogen. But I think the caveat when looking at this is that these are older varieties. We've seen big improvements in yield potential, as well as some of the characteristics that may have limited nitrogen application for malt barley in the past. Those contra characteristics for end-use quality that can limit what you want to put down for nitrogen. So lodging is certainly an issue. We see that chart over there on the right. As the nitrogen fertility increases, so too does the lodging. Now, the lodging is typically rated on a 9-point scale. So even in this, the overall amount of lodging is relatively low. It's higher at a higher seeding rate. Lower seeding rate can mitigate lodging a little bit, but you get the offset of some of the things that Andrew and Jeremy were talking about there. So trying to find that balance between seeding rate and fertility and managing that lodging. And of course, there's other tools like plant growth regulators that can mitigate lodging, which were not available when this research was done. Looking strictly at a relationship to yield, what they were finding was about 90 kilograms per hectare or pounds per acre, relatively nearly 1-to-1 relationship between kilograms per hectare and pounds per acre. Seemed to be optimal for the varieties that were used when this trial was done, which I believe were Metcalf and Copeland. And of course, the relationship too between the tillering and fertility on the chart B there. As the fertility increased, so too did the tillering, but that can be managed or mitigated somewhat with the seeding rate, keeping those tillers a little bit lower and more manageable to get that optimum timing at Fusarium fungicide application timing and for harvest. Now, I mentioned some end-use characteristics that can be negative with higher fertility. That's plump seeds and protein. So a decreasing amount of plump seeds occurring with higher fertility. And so trying to find that balance. And I think for the most part, this study was finding that balance. The protein was not out of the range of what the end users were looking for, and nor were the plump seeds too low. But I think what I would add to this slide is that we've seen a lot of work here in recent years with newer varieties, comparing them back to the older standards like Metcalf. And these newer varieties, they have higher yield potential, relatively lower protein, better resistance to lodging, and better resistance to disease. And so we've seen in the small plot research and from what we've heard from producers, that these new varieties have the potential to be pushed a little bit. There's room to bump up the nitrogen fertility on these varieties and drive towards higher yields, because they're not going to max out as easily on protein and exceed those malt characteristics quite as easily. They'll stand up better, and they do have some better disease resistance characteristics.
Yeah, Mitchell, it's some great points with the newer varieties and being able to push it, because certainly in Alberta, we're hearing some of the same things with some of those new varieties of being able to kind of push them a little bit harder and reduce that lodging risk that impacts quality and still maintain the end use quality that the buyers are looking for. And this was a trial that is a field scale trial that was done in Alberta in 2022 and in Bentley. So on the west of Highway 2, so higher moisture situations here. high yield potential. But I thought this was a good example of talking about that balance between quality and yield, and how to make the most out of making sure you're making the right decision of how much nitrogen is putting down. So this trial was looking at, albeit searish barley, but the example still stands in terms of finding that balance. So this soil had about 30 pounds of residual nitrogen left over from a soil test that was done, and we did three different full replicated treatments, 65 pounds of nitrogen, 85 pounds of nitrogen, and then 105 pounds of nitrogen. And then we did a single strip with 0 pounds of nitrogen just to see how that would look visually. We came back in August and took a look, and you can see, that lodging comparison between 65 and 105, and 85 and 105. And then 0, where we almost have no lodging at all, or 0 lodging, and 65, where you can see slight lodging throughout the field. Now, mind you, this was a more significant lodging area in the field. As we headed further down, it was a little bit less. But it shows the example again of balancing that fine line and finding what nitrogen rates in your growing region are going to be ideal with the amount of lodging you can deal with. Whether you want to be using a PGR to help mitigate some of that lodging, and the variety that you're working with, and selecting a variety that has decent lodging resistance in situations or in a growing region where you feel like it's a higher risk when you're really trying to push that yield potential. So it's not going to be the same for everyone. It's not going to be 90 pounds per acre. Those new varieties we can push a little bit further, but it'll take a little bit of either working with an agronomist who has experience in the region to determine what is an ideal nitrogen rate for that variety for your region, or doing some testing on your own farm to determine, what may be an ideal approach for me in terms of yield potential, nitrogen rates, and maintaining that end use quality to make sure you're selling into the market that you want to.
And as Jeremy talked about doing some testing on your own farm, I'd like to mention too that I think all the commissions, all 3 commissions now run on-farm trials, and one of them is testing nitrogen rates for specifically these newer varieties. So if you're interested in something like that, where to do a little bit of testing, they're fully replicated, and it really allows you to gather some great on-farm practical data for you to apply further on into different growing seasons. So reach out to any of us if that's something you're interested in.
So we talked a little bit earlier about weed pressure and seeding rates. And this is actually an example from winter wheat, but again, I think it drives the message home about the impact that weeds can have if left untethered, or not managed in an inappropriate way. So we know that crops will respond to weed presence once those weeds pop out of the ground. There's a non-physical relationship that happens between plants, weeds, and crops, where crops can actually sense when a weed is around them. And the physiology and biology of that plant will change and adjust because they're responding to it as competition. So it may result in taller plants, or more tillering, which can take away from some of the yield potential and quality aspects of that crop. So managing those weeds early with a spring burn down and scouting that crop early to make sure you're managing it as quickly as you can, but obviously waiting for some of those weeds to pop up that may be flushing soon, is going to be your best defense against controlling some of these weeds, in addition to making sure that you have an appropriate seeding rate. So being on top of that early in the season, making sure that doesn't get ahead of you, and assessing what weeds you may deal with in that crop prior to getting that crop in the ground. And that's scouting records from previous crops, and knowing what you may deal with and where your issue areas are, so you can address them in a timely manner. And that's going to tie back again to harvestability, tillering an even crop, because weeds will cause variability in your crop staging. Because if you have higher weed areas, you're going to see different growth patterns within those areas compared to non-weedy areas. So you want to be on top of that early in the season to mitigate some of those issues.
And so moving on to some disease risk and disease management, one that comes top of mind, especially for when you're looking at barley, malting barley, is Fusarium Head Blight. There's very low thresholds for acceptance of barley that's been infected with FHB. So it's one of the main diseases that we're looking for. In Manitoba, specifically, barley acres were really reduced due to the presence of FHB and FHB pressures. So it's something that's always top of mind. And there's a few management strategies you can use to reduce risk, reduce your FHB risk. And that starts, in my eyes, is always what's at the heart of disease management is your crop rotations, for one. So managing your crop rotation to not be quite as tight and have at least 1 to 2 break years between a susceptible crop, such as like wheat or in that area of the world also corn, as they're quite susceptible to FHB and it will stay in the residue. As well, know your fields and keep disease records. If there's been serious outbreaks in different fields across your farm, note that, and that's also another important thing to note as you're doing your overall planning. Use clean seed and disease-free seed. So this could include getting seed tested prior to the season, as infected seed can cause, if it's with Fusarium infection, can cause stand reductions through root rots and such. And if there is a disease risk there, think about using seed treatment fungicide, again, to try to reduce that root rot, which will change crop uniformity. If there's some mortality, there might be increased tillering. And then that plays back to Jeremy's comments back to, about you wanting the uniformity when you're applying some crop protection agents there. When looking at other like in-season FHB considerations is there's a new FHB monitoring map or risk map, which was released last year, and it covers all 3 prairie provinces. This can give you a guide to what your FHB risk might be in your area, but it does still require subsequent field scouting to look at what on the ground moisture conditions and actually if the crop's at a susceptible stage for FHB infection. For barley is a little different than wheat. It flowers in the boot, so you're not going to see that same anthesis as you'd see in wheat. So and it also shows infection a little differently as well. But when you're thinking about fungicide application decisions, as it flowers in the boot, you're really aiming for application between 70 and 100% of heads have emerged, and you'd like to aim closer to that 100% because you need to protect that material. What the fungicide hits is what's going to be protected to some extent, as fungicides only offer about 50% suppression. There's a few other tools that can be used, such as variety selection. There have been improvements in variety resistance to FHB, and having a multi-layered approach to FHB management is integral. Looking at identification of FHB in barley, it's a little different than wheat. The infected kernels keep a little more of that plumpness. They don't have that quite the same tombstone look. So you will see, you can see the image on the top right there. They become more stained almost. There's that dark staining, and you might see some sporulation of a salmony color as well in that on those infected kernels. But this also plays into that also plays into your fungicide strategies and broader looking at diseases affecting barley. So that turns us back to what we were discussing before, looking at like varieties, choose a variety with a strong resistance package for diseases in your area. For instance, in Manitoba, spot blotch is very common due to our growing conditions. While in Alberta, I believe scald is more present. So when you're making variety selection choices, think about what diseases am I actually working with in your growing region. As well, focus when you're applying a fungicide, and again, focus on fungicide applications on yield-bearing leaves and looking at disease thresholds. So yield-bearing leaves, again, are a little different in barley. It has a smaller flag leaf, so that penultimate leaf actually contributes quite a bit to yield compared to the flag leaf. So being able to protect those leaves is very important. As well, try to avoid unnecessary sprays. So there has been some research done when applying a fungicide at herbicide or PGR timing, and the result, this was in Western Canada, and the results show that there really wasn't any yield benefit in the long term, as again, you're not protecting those yield-bearing leaves, which contributes so much to your overall yield in the end. I'd also like to point out to keep following keep it clean guidelines, and speak to your buyer about crop protection products that you use to avoid market risks. I'd also like to plug, if you have want more information on diseases, the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network has some great, they're almost like placards and cards you can look at that provide some management tips and identification of diseases.
Yeah, and as we transition into the new variety section, I think that point Andrew made about managing for Fusarium and getting that fungicide on is really critical to get it directly onto the heads, because any heads that have not yet emerged, they won't be protected, and so that's a very narrow window. And so trying to mitigate and manage to reduce any impact from FHB is pretty important. And I think Andrew's going to talk again in a couple slides about the actual disease resistance ratings about some of these new varieties. This section here is focused entirely on yield, and this is pulling data from some of the top varieties. I think all the malts, except at the very bottom, includes Austenson. And I think the critical reason to include Austenson in this chart is to show how far some of these new malt varieties have come. We've seen Synergy hit the market in the early 2010s, and it was a game changer because it became competitive with the feed varieties, with the top feed variety, which was CDC Austenson. And Austenson does continue to be that top feed variety across the prairies. So with malt varieties that are so competitive with feed, it's kind of guides the decision of what to grow towards a malting variety, because there's that much potential there, and it opens up marketing to that malt market that isn't there with a feed variety. So the highlighted varieties here are Connect, Copeland, Fraser, and Prairie. These Copeland has been a dominant variety for a long time. Synergy overtook it a few years ago as the top malting variety. That high yield potential of Synergy, I think, helped drive that to be one of those more in-demand varieties. But the ones that Peter showed on the slide as gaining market acceptance are AAC Connect and CDC Fraser.
Should have Churchill indicated there too, highlighted.
Yeah.
Mitch, I just noticed.
Not highlighted, it's just above the top highlight there. And it's just certainly in the Saskatchewan guide, it jumps out well above any of the other varieties, both in the southern and the northern regions. That has been a key distinction, I think, for Churchill, where it's performing well across all environments. And so having these new varieties that with this high yield potential, I think is really key. And I alluded to that earlier when I was talking about nitrogen management and the ability to push these new varieties further. Managing these new varieties, whether it's a Churchill, a Connect, or a Fraser, or that up and comer, a Prairie, managing them like a Metcalf or a Copeland will underutilize the potential of these varieties.
Looking at continuing looking at these new varieties. So the new Canadian malting varieties have been selected for quite a few different traits. So like higher yields, improving lodging resistance, and improved disease resistance. And we're lucky in Canada, the breeding programs have produced some great new varieties that are, and with a bunch of other work, have now started to gain market acceptance for maltsters, emperors. And one of the biggest changes that I feel that we've seen is the improved disease resistance packages from some of these crops. So these can also be found in your seed guide. Probably can't see that, but these resistance strains can be found in your seed guide. But what the takeaway from this is that there's trade-offs between first yield and disease resistance amongst all these varieties and lodging as well. So when making a variety decision, you really want to choose the appropriate variety for your disease pressures. So for instance, in the Red River Valley, if you're thinking about growing malting barley, there's only one variety that has an MR, and that's AAC Connect. But if that is not as big of a concern, and there's leaf disease, for instance, is a bigger concern, you might want to move to one of the other newer malting barley varieties. So this inherent genetic resistance is another layer to your disease management plans, and is an important step. And luckily, with our breeding with the varieties that are continue to be bred, hopefully our disease resistance continue to improve.
Okay, thanks, guys. So that was a great overview of the seeding and production considerations. So just moving on to talk a little bit more about the newer varieties. And Mitchell had just talked about the yield potential of the new varieties. As Mitchell indicated, AAC Synergy really was a game changer with a noticeable bump in yields for malt barley varieties, making it competitive with feed varieties like CDC Austenson. And similarly, some of the newer varieties like Connect, Fraser, and Churchill, as we just talked about, also with comparable yields to AAC Synergy, or in the case of CDC Churchill, a little better. But in terms of marketability and acceptance of these new varieties, this is where we certainly have some challenges in transitioning end-use customers to new varieties. So we've been working very hard with our domestic partners and our international customers to gain acceptance. And today we can confidently say that in addition to Synergy and Copeland, newer varieties like AAC Connect and CDC Fraser are now broadly accepted in the domestic market and increasingly accepted in the international market. So markets like China for malting barley, and markets like the US, Mexico, and Japan for processed malt. Increasingly, these new varieties are accepted by end users. And we're working diligently on getting CDC Churchill accepted as well, with the great yields and good processing characteristics. We're seeing pretty quick adoption domestically in Canada of this new variety, CDC Churchill, and we've done trials in China and sent samples to our customers in various markets. So we are seeing growing acceptance CDC Churchill as well. So the 5 varieties that I mentioned at the beginning on that recommended list, CDC Copeland, AEC Synergy, AEC Connect, CDC Fraser, and CDC Churchill. Producers can feel confident that all these varieties are accepted to greater or lesser degrees by our domestic and international malting and brewing end-use customers. So maybe I'll let Jeremy sum it up for us today.
I get to do the why choose barley, and I think, you know, there's a lot of potential and value in having malt barley in the rotation. And I like Mitchell's point about some of these new varieties really allowing producers to have access to both feed and malt markets if they are utilizing some of these newer malt varieties, because that yield potential is there. So you're that gap in economic potential between those two end uses, I think, has closed quite significantly with some of these new varieties. But barley really is a cost-effective crop to grow. We see lower input costs required to get the yield potential and the quality out of it. So your input costs are lower, so it can be a risk mitigating crop to put in that regard when you're looking at a full crop rotation aspect. It is earlier maturing. So when you're talking about balancing, what am I harvesting first? How can I manage all of these different crops? It does allow some gap in time to be able to get that crop off earlier, and free up a bit of time for you to manage some of the other stuff on farm. And I mentioned the dual marketability of those new varieties because of that closed economic gap. And a lot of these new varieties are showing huge leaps in terms of disease resistance and pest resistance. And that really helps mitigate some of the risk inherent in growing crops in general. But when we look at some of the advancements in the malt barley side, it is taking away some of those risks that were inherent with some of the older varieties, and having it be a more safe crop to grow overall. So great potential for the farm, and I think something that, had you grown 10 years ago and hadn't done it again, maybe it's time to revisit and look at some of those new varieties and see how they fit in your farm.
Okay, so that concludes the presentation and the slides from our presenters today. I think, as Jeremy said, and Mitchell alluded to, that when a producer, if you choose to grow a malting barley variety, there's lots of considerations here in terms of meeting those end-use quality characteristics. And so hopefully the information today has helped producers better understand how they can seed and grow malt barley to effectively meet those end-use quality specifications. And ultimately, the premium that can be associated with being selected as malt barley can make an enormous difference in terms of the profitability of malt barley as a crop.